negotiate that. But first of all, before anything else from me, we'll have RMIT's Dr. Carolyn Briggs welcome us to country.
Hi everyone. So welcome to our beautiful presentation today. Yes, my name is Dr. Carolyn Briggs and I'm a descendant of the Wurrung of the Boon Wurrung language group. So in the presentation it's about Wominjeka Djeembana Bunurong Namda Barupton after Wurrung. Come with a purpose to our beautiful home, the lands of the two great bays. It is my great pleasure to be able to welcome you all here this afternoon, but it is also my responsibility to ensure that you do come with a purpose. Wominjeka, come, ask to come, and what is your intention? I do so not only on behalf of my ancestors, the Wurrung of the Boon Wurrung. I do so on behalf of all First Nations people on which lands we meet today. First Nations people across Australia, or what we now know as Australia, all shared a special connection to the lands and waters of their ancestors that has not been disconnected from the time of millennia, despite the dispossession, the displacement, the discrimination that we've all experienced over the last 200 years. These connections for us dates back to our creation stories. For the Wurrung of the Boon Wurrung, our creation stories tells us about Bundjalung, our creative spirit, who travels as an eagle, and how he created the lands and waters around where we meet today. He also created the Kulin people and taught them about the circular relationships that they have with these lands and waters in order for us to be taken care of by the land. We also have to take care of that land, and we did this through adhering to the Wurrung Bhig, our laws of the land, our customary laws. Much like our laws today, these laws dictated how we interact with each other and how we interact with the land that we now conduct ourselves in whilst we are on other people's country. The Boon Wurrung Wurrung Bhig speaks of 3 Pacific laws. Yilanj. It's about knowledge. It is that responsibility that we have knowledge. And once we've attained that knowledge, we have the responsibility to ensure that its survival, its continuation. We have the responsibility for our younger generations to maintain that knowledge and pass it down so it can be used for future generations. We also have the law of Djeembana. This law speaks of community, the importance of community, the importance of our diverse communities, but a unified community. The Boon Wurrung and the Kulin people understood the power of diversity that is within our lands and increases our capabilities. It was always good to share stories of our different experiences. However, it was always good to understood to utilise this very powerful tool. They had to identify a common purpose. And what are those things that we do have in common? Finally, the last law is connection to country, or what we might call honouring sacred ground. Or we could call it Pabanata, Mother Earth, paying respects to our past generations, the people who took care of the land before us, the people who have lived and died before we were here, paying respects to those stories and history within the lands, paying respects on the lands we live today We are very fortunate in this place we now know as Australia to have 80,000 years plus of human history. And it is important to pay respects to that history, not only while we're here at work or when we go home. And if we can adhere to those three Wurrung Bhigs, I can say again in my ancestors' language, Wominjeka Djeembana Bundjalung Namder Barupton Ata Willem, come with a purpose to our beautiful home. Marin is Western Port Bay and Nairn is Port Phillip Bay. So this was once known in history as Port Phillip Bay. So it's gone through different iterations, but it is about welcoming you, and I pay my respects to all of you who are in attendance today. And it is about the journey, sharing these experiences with us. Nungujin. I'm in your presence and you are in mine.
Thanks, Narwit Auntie. Now we will have Professor Brian Martin also make an acknowledgement of country and introduce himself.
Thank you, James. Of course, always thank you, Auntie Caroline, with much respect to you always. So, hello everyone. So Negala na Jungan, Negala Gira Mala Jungan, Hola Jala Mala Gala Jungan, Negala Wala Jala Mala Jungan, Negala na Mala Jungan. Yan Yimba Gina Gang, Wurrung Jungan, Wurrung Jungan, and Negala Gàidheal Bundjalung. Bunya Brian Martin, Negala Gàidheal Bundjalung, Muruwari, Kamilaroi Jungan. Hello everyone, I've said we belong to country, we look after country, we don't do wrong around country, we don't harm country, we belong to country. I show my respects, of course, for Wurrung country where I'm located, also to Bundjalung country, and also extend that respects to the great ancestor Bundjalung of the Kulin Nations. And also said, my name is Brian Martin, and I pay my respects, of course, to great ancestor Wurrung from Bundjalung country, but also my ancestry is Muruwari and Kamilaroi. Also the Associate Dean, Indigenous at Monash Art Design and Architecture Faculty, and also the Director of Wominjeka Djeembana Research Lab, and also I think I'm an artist or practitioner or something like that. Changes every day, I suppose, which it should. So good to be here. So thank you, Art, and thank you, James.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and I'll position my own self. Is Misha Seumas Chatriona, Dhomhnuill Bhig, Machal mich fitter Wurrung. I acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Wurrung language groups also, and particularly I give my thank yous to Narwit Auntie Carolyn for that welcome of many of which I've experienced and I'm very grateful of. Thank you to Brian Martin also for being with us today. I acknowledge the ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging, in particular of the Wurrung and Wurrung peoples. When I was positioning myself, I was acknowledging my own ancestors, which is important to me. I recited 7 generations back there, which tightly connects me to country, or what we call duchas in my own language and culture, and which we also have native title for, if that's any sort of useful language at times, and also language protection. So today we're gathering not in any way to represent RMIT or specifically any university or institution, but the 3 of us work together and have worked together for over the years in different ways, but explicitly we work together at Wominjeka Djeembana Research Lab at Monash University, which has been explicitly set up as an Indigenous practice research lab. So that's really the theme of our conversation today. It does touch on broader issues, of course, because there's a situation and a context that also adheres to and collides with. So today we have called the panel and conversation, really, Indigenous practice research working with indigeneity. Now that could mean lots of different things to lots of people. We of course don't know exactly who's in the audience today, so happy for people to put their names in the chat box there and state, position themselves, even where you're based, what country you're on, what you do, etc. Feel free to do that. But we've also flagged that we're going to talk a little bit around the context of decolonial thinking or practice, or what sometimes gets labelled and branded as decolonization. Is it a metaphor? Is it not a metaphor? Is it a hat that's convenient to wear for institutions? And what does it mean and look like and feel like? And what are the consequences of that even? So, as I'm going to read a few statements out, and then we'll start a conversation, and then we'll have a few questions that we'll share between the three of us. Then about halfway through, hopefully, maybe people will put some questions in the chat even, and we can open it out to a wider conversation. If you don't want to put a question in the chat, if you'd rather speak using your voice, just put your hand up in the function in Teams hand raising function. And apologies obviously in advance if we do not get round everyone's questions or etc. So we'll have it as open a conversation and as meaningful a conversation as possible. But so, as I said, implicitly our conversation today is around the theme of Indigenous practice research. But you know, the point is not to propose or suggest that there is a toolkit or a method for Indigenous practice research. It's not about conforming to, let's call it, extractivist sort of paradigms of research that exist often within institutions, certainly within epistemologies of the West. But we're engaged here in a multivocal reflection, if you like, on relationships. So that's a key, I think, a key question, issue is relationships and the ethics of relationships and ethical relationships. So, as I said, I'm going to just read a few quotations out for you. First one is, and these are sort of provocations or propositions for you to think about in terms of more explicitly to do with the title and theme of the talk panel that might stir your own questions. So think of the quotations in those terms. So first one is actually from an article Brian Martin wrote with colleagues from across the globe, I think, actually. Brian can correct me, from an article called Situating Decolonization, an Indigenous Dilemma. And the quotation is, and apologies for being Brian's voice on this occasion, being Indigenous and operating in an institution such as a university places us in a complex position. The premise of decolonizing history, literature, curriculum and thought in general creates a tenuous space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to confront a shared colonial condition. What does decolonization mean for Indigenous peoples? Is decolonization an implied promise to squash the tropes of coloniality, or is it a way for non-Indigenous people to create another paradigm or site for their own resistance or transgression of thinking? So what are the roles of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this space of educational potential, this curriculum called decolonization? So the following quote, much shorter, from the famous article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang from Turtle Island. Decolonization is accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and futurity. And then another short quote from Cree scholar Sean Wilson, who actually is also based. He was at Monash at one point, Brian, wasn't he? But I'm not sure where he is now. But he's still somewhere around in Australia. New South Wales. Relationality. So in a sort of articulation of what relationality means, he states, relationships do not merely shape reality, they are reality. So that's the thoughts put out there, and I think what I'd like to start off by asking Narit, Auntie Caroline, and Brian is about let's call it the 3 C's of culture in this context: cultural safety, cultural competence, and cultural leadership, and the relationship between those things. I think cultural safety is a big...
Cultural safety. How do we measure cultural safety? I'm feeling comfortable to be able to discuss these things, but are people culturally competent? Because I think I argue against cultural awareness. I really would. How do we address cultural competence? Are people culturally competent in working in our space? And how do they demonstrate that? And how do, as an elder, I would demonstrate my cultural authority as a leader. And that's what it means. My role is inherited role, and I had to scaffold my process. So cultural safety is allowing people to come in and feel that they can feel culturally safe, but do they understand what it means to be culturally safe? You know, and what I've got to also feel, how do I feel culturally safe when I go into these types of institutions that have, you know, within these systems or these institutions have marginalised me as the other. And how do I break that code of feeling safe as I transition through these systems, like very much a Western system that has navigated my world and my life. And when you're brought up as an Indigenous person in this country, you are marginalised as the deficit, and breaking those boundaries, I suppose. And when you've lived under the Act, I lived under 2 acts, so I'm very conscious of how that's played out in my life. So that's what I see.
Yeah.
And I hope somewhere that's something we need to think about, because when you know about country, you know about identity, you know about, and how it's been a challenge, I think, because you don't deceive yourself as being a part of something, that you fit within this very complex academic world, because it's like white is right or Western systems is right, and then you've got to challenge it and say, you know, it's about that modelling. It's about that relationship between. It's the, how do you identify yourself? I think I'm just rambling now, so I'll pass it over to...
No.
I think something about that. It took me a long time to let go of that insecurity as a feeling I didn't fit the formula of what is my identity. I have I'm a Turawai, I'm Wurrung, I am Wemba, I am are these people that make up. I have the British as well. Briggs was British, you know, so he colonised and he went to Tasmania, but the women were taken to Tasmania. I'm a descendant of that. I'm a descendant, you know, and I am fighting for country. So challenging, always challenging the Western paradigm, even in law, and that is taking a stand against that British law system that we all live under, or religious or whatever modelling they use.
There's lots of entanglements there.
There's a lot of
complexity.
Complexities, you know, and you have to navigate through these things. It's another test, and for our young people to feel safe to go through these systems culturally, and people out there to be culturally competent about their own identity. And being culturally, I think it's about demonstrating. There's a different word of what leadership is. Western modelling is leadership is a very white construct. Leadership is something how you move forward and as a collective, not as an individual.
Yeah.
That's my way I see my world.
Brian?
In terms of what Artie was talking about in terms of cultural safety, there is that importance about the difference between cultural awareness and cultural competency. I think there's a deeper engagement or deeper articulation or ontology to cultural competency, which is really important. I think these things are premised by a matrix of relations between us, but also that in intersection with the institution ceding power. And I think that's one of the most important things, is if the institution doesn't want to cede power and allow us for things to be Indigenous led, then things like cultural competency and cultural safety don't exist. You know, and we spoke earlier where we're all from and connected to Wominjeka Djeembana Research Lab. Of course, you know, that's something that the aim of the Indigenous Research Lab at Monash University is about creating that space of not only research but also pedagogical engagement pursuits, and the intersection of indigeneity within the university structure as well. And you know, we've all, the three of us have been around a while in terms of these institutions, but I think it's fair to say that we've sort of seasoned in the way of, you know, I suppose, demanding from the institution to cede its power to allow us to provide that leadership in that space. So hopefully that's what Wominjeka Djeembana is doing, and I think the way it sort of started in terms of you know, talking to Auntie Carolyn about what sort of name we should call our space, and of course being on Wurrung country, and you know, always talks about Wominjeka not only just being a welcome, but a welcome which is ingrained in obligation, law, ritualised practice and learning, and then of course Djeembana not only being a gathering place, but also a mob to barter, to exchange knowledge as well. So we hope that synergies between those two things are articulated through the lab and creates a culturally safe space as well. And as you know, part of the purview of the lab is also to lead the decolonial and indigenisation of curriculum within the university and beyond as well. And it's an interesting discussion today in terms of what does this mean for us? You know, what does decolonisation mean? Essentially, and, you know, even Tuck, you know, decolonisation is not a metaphor. It's about revisiting what that means, because it does change from, you know, throughout the different types of resistant movements around the globe, but also in particular the resistant movements in Australia since colonisation and invasion, and what does that mean for us today?
Something that you've often said to me is about how universities are an abstraction. When we get, you know, cross about, you know, everyone gets cross about institutions and the certain things and behaviours. But this idea that they're an abstraction is, I find, interesting, and you know, ideas like decolonisation are to a degree also an abstraction, and Auntie, you spoke a few minutes ago about how, you know, it's really important that when you're stepping into a real space, it's not just an idea. University is an idea of public good at one level, but also of, you know, it's also a business. How do you feel safe stepping into that space? And importantly, because I know it's really important to you, what community feels, how community feels space.
And it is something, it took me a long time to let go of my feeling inadequate, or this thing that we talk about, the syndrome of not being seen or being in the right space or place. But I see now it could be a tool. It's a tool of flipping. I'm flipping it into a way that's going to meet the needs of our younger generations. You know, there will be things that they will see and how people create their expertise from by studying us. It's not their lived experience. So, you know, they extract our knowledge and make it their own, and then they become they're professionals at this thing. And what we've got to do is flip that. We can turn it around on them, I think, because they're always writing from this paradigm as the other, the third person, and they see us as the third person. So we've got to bring ourselves into the front of the beginning of the writings, or the what Brian always says, if people are going to utilise your knowledge, people should respect that and author it. You co-author. And that's something that challenged me for a while. And then I thought, yes, I'm giving people a lot of genuine knowledge as what I understand is my knowledge that I grew up with, to assist other people. But it's about the ethics and it's about respect. And if people are genuine in that research or extracting knowledge from other Indigenous people, they should co-author with them. And it's turned me around a lot more of understanding how we make this system work for us as a tool. It's a tool. And, you know, it's that sort of, and it's interesting everybody's identify what country they're on or where they're from.
Right.
It's great. One day I'll get them to spell it properly. But, you know, they're all, I think it's great that they're acknowledging country and then acknowledging there's a big learning. Obviously, it's coming out. And I see that through that they've taken time out to learn about who they are or where they're from or what land they're on. And I appreciate that.
Thinking about the flipping and, you know, using, for want of a better word, the university for wider public good, which of course is about a lot to do with the ethics of relationships. And, you know, just to spin off what you spoke about a second ago, I remember Brian also telling me another time about having to sort of educate somebody, if you like, about being worried about not having their primacy in a research project, and the idea that, but it's my scholarship, they were saying, I think it was to you, Brian, and you reminded them, yeah, but it's not your knowledge. And I think that's the kind, you know, that flipping is quite sensitive within the way universities are structured. And so in a sense, they're not just abstract, of course, they are very material in the way that they impact lives and do make people feel confident or lacking confidence or safe or unsafe. And thinking about Wominjeka Djeembana, Brian, and the way it has evolved, because I was involved with a working group with yourself before it existed that sort of led to its establishment. And just it's a bit of a journey there, obviously, from it being a bit of an abstract idea to becoming a material reality as a lab that's now, I would say, very successful in a short space of time. Just be interesting, maybe if you wouldn't mind, just saying a little bit about what the lab has achieved and the direction it's going and the kind of projects. I mean, particularly you yourself and Narwit, Carolyn are involved in a heck of a lot of projects.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think just to answer that first thing in terms of, I suppose when I tend to go off the dial a bit and talk about universities being abstractions, is I'm talking essentially on a Western conception of abstraction and how they're usually entities running around in silos, bumping into each other. And but I think if we relate the relationship between abstraction, representation, and materiality, that's more of an ontological discussion that we don't tend to have faith that the university system doesn't understand yet. Whether that's arrogant or not, let's leave it up. Maybe some questions from the audience later. But I mean, the great thing about going back to what Arnt was talking about, and you've referred to as well, is the initial idea, of course, of the research lab at MADA, Monash Design and Architecture, Wominjeka Djeembana, was really about the synergies between practice-led research and Indigenous-led research and how they intersect and how they can knock down the silos of art, design, architecture, and beyond. So we look at Indigenous knowledge it can be a paradigm of thinking within these structures, and it can become a platform for this intersection between all the disciplines within these institutions, and not as a side or an add-on, but it's leading it. So to hold these research projects and research in general, curriculum is Indigenous-led. And what that means is we're looking into deep memory, we're looking into deep history, deep time, deep practice, and re-articulation and regeneration and a ritualisation of that practice into a contemporary setting, which also articulates our futures. That's why we talk about Indigenous futures. The great thing about the lab, yes, it is a materialisation of those things. In 2018, in setting it up, and then subsequently sort of opening in 2019, from one Indigenous PhD candidate and about, I think, 4 staff, and now about 15 PhDs. By the end of the year, there's another 4, so it'll be 19 PhD candidates, and around there's about 12, and by the end of the year, probably 14 staff associated with Wominjeka Djeembana. So, and in that, there's a whole number of projects that have materialised, especially we've got the hat trick of 3 ARC grants in 1 year. So we're not mucking around. So it's our business. So I think, there's the ARC Strategic Research Initiative with Bhig Andrew, Northern Gulani, trees in Southeast Australia. The ARC linkage at Carolyn, the leading repairing memory in place, Indigenous that approach to urban water design. And of course, just recently made public the ARC Discovery Grant Protocols for Indigenous-led creative practice, which looks at the Indigenous design charters. Also, we're part of the Fire to Flourish program, so looking at how cultural burning in caring for country in bushfire ravaged areas in New South Wales and my community in Victoria as well, which is quite a large project for the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And of course, we're involved in a few social sciences and humanities research council projects led out of course, Turtle Island in Canada, but of course being partners on that as well. So within a very short period of time, we're making a lot of inroads into the system, but also a lot of research which is very material and changes people's lives and has high impact in terms of every PhD candidate's on full scholarship, and there's an investment into this space. It's about changing people's lives in that way. And I'm very fortunate to be sort of in education for the last 20 years and in that being able to invest in our futures, in the younger generations. And I suppose the great thing about having Auntie Caroline there is we've got this amazing synergy between deep time, deep history, and contemporary manifestations of that. And that's what's exciting about these projects. And we always have these conversations that we're not the afterthought. We're not going away. We're not the other. It's a primacy of who we are, and we're leading it. and that's why the future is Indigenous, and if that's just the way it's going to be, because we've been here for a long time, and I think if we look at sustainability, we look at so many different things, it's our time. And I think that's a little bit different to the practices of the decolonial movement of the 1980s and the 90s. I think it is slightly different today, and I think, talking to even Tuck, I think they might agree, we replace that word with indigenisation, not decolonisation. I think it's about us shifting the narrative, and there's an intersection between those two different things, which is really interesting.
Great, thanks. Yeah, incredible impacts already, and as you say, not mucking about. Not mucking about, and got obviously great experience and competence in the group, but also what, as you were saying earlier, it's like this is the real consequence of ceding power. Ceding power isn't about jockey careers and whatever in a university. It's actually about these real world impacts for safe space for Indigenous candidates, and including many from around the world, because I know a lot of the candidates. And these great projects that are demonstrations of the transdisciplinarity of not just the expertise, but of the ethos as well. I mean, Ngāri Anti, you've been around the education system in Victoria, for this place called Victoria, for a good while, and you obviously Wominjeka Djeembana is a latest version of this, and I'm just wondering about your reflections on what has been about positive change that has maybe been going on, and are things to be mindful and careful about.
I think probably if I think about back and reflection of the early days of my journey, going into working in or being a part of the university system, it was pretty overwhelming. But to see and meet pretty amazing Indigenous people, leaders of a different time as activists, and that was from the 60s and 70s. So I was at Monash very early. So these were coming. This probably helped evolve my Black consciousness of what it meant to be my identity, and being fed this amazing, and seeing a lot of our older people now, as you know them as those activists of that period of time, and being influenced about understanding what it did occur, and being confident to be able to go into different areas within the universities around Victoria. Being in Melbourne Uni and working in La Trobe Uni, and I think I've only a little time in Deakin, but Victoria Uni, 5 years of piloting programs, but ensuring that our young people got through this minefield of a system that a lot of our young people were experiencing, and building on the family's aspirations to achieve in this very colonial construct. And that was breaking those barriers down, and seeing those young people achieve where they went on to was probably the greatest feel of what this system can do for us. And they carry that experience with them, that you valued them, that we could work together as a collective, and seeing them grow into the people that they are today. So that's probably the only way I was able to use the tool to build and strengthen the futures. So, and they will build the next generation. So that's what universities have done. I never thought I'd ever get there. Then I thought I'd better knuckle down and write a paper about it, and then get my doctorate. And then that was the journey that challenged me because you're having to give a lot of yourself and share a lot about and unpacking myself to be exposed to an audience that whether I trusted or I felt culturally safe with, because it was about oral tradition, but bringing it into the academic framework of today. So the balance, there was some sort of challenge for me to share something about myself, but it was also, I was supported by a young fellow in Swinburne when I started off to do a master's, and then it suddenly turned into a PhD. And he gave me a move forward, and so did another person by the name of Dory Tunstall. And my confidence arose out of that. Sometimes I go back and feel that syndrome of not quite real, but that's the challenge and the expectation. But it's that thing that you brought up with values, the guiding principles about what I talked about in a welcome. It's not just a welcome, it's ushering you and affording you the right to a tanderum. And that means to accept you and acknowledge that you are on unceded lands of our, the Kulin Nation. And I noted they said all that, so somewhere, and I see Wiradjuri there, and I see all those family connections to different parts of our linkage. So, and I'm honoured that we can do that. And if the people are confident enough to understand they're on unceded lands of different groups, that's the start of the change. They're learning. There might have been slow learners at the beginning, but now they're evolving, like morphing.
But also it spreads wide, and people may or may not be aware that Auntie Carolyn's had a lot of influence in the education of young people in the Bayside area in particular, where I think they've mainly taken on your kindergarten programs, early childhood. Because my own son Callum, his whole knowledge of creation is completely founded in the story of the Bundjalung and the Bay, and
the
it's
creation.
like he's enthralled with that story. So it's not just at the upper echelons of universities. It's also down at the beginnings of formal education, and I think that just also demonstrates your commitment to community as a whole entity and country, clearly, obviously.
Yes.
And
valuing country and valuing the knowledge that comes from country. You are made up of many stories, and it's bringing those stories out that young people then can identify with or feel that they have a connection to, without feeling alienated or coming with guilt or coming with all these negative values, I suppose, because it is a negative energy that they feel guilt or something like that. How do we flip that and say, well, is that a wasted energy, or can we make that an outcome? Take action. Don't give me words. Deliver them in actions. Children do it quite well. Babies do it really well. And it's a progression of that learning process that we all go through. And I was privileged to grow up in that strength of identity and culture from very early. It was always seen as a deficit, but it's something that is the mastery. It's the mastery of knowledge that you've never been taught that was that mastery of knowledge that you've been shared with. It wasn't written. People write it now as authority, but they'll never have it because they've never lived it. And I think we share those lived experiences with people to go on their own journeys and experiential processes.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to, there's a tap just outside there. I'm just seeing if anyone has a question, throw your hand up. You don't have to, but you're more than welcome. And there's lots of wonderful hellos, etc. there, which is good. If anyone wants to throw in a question in the chat, I'll do my best to get round to it. Oh, there is a question from Mito Yahanbati. Hello.
Yes, thank you. I'm a lecturer in sustainability and urban planning, and I'm speaking from the Wurrung country. My question is for Brian. I teach students urban design, and often I get this question once from a student who was from one of the Pacific Island countries, asking that wayfinding and narrative is such a Western concept. I don't look at signages on street. We look at stars and find our way around. Similarly, this year, we participated in international design competition by the 40 mayors who want to act on climate change, C40. And one of my groups wanted to design with indigeneity in mind. And she referred to a lot of literature, but I am not capable of really giving that support. And I was wondering if at all there is an opportunity or a way to collaborate, to work together, and from the very start, rather than coming at the end, as you rightly mentioned, to bring climate resilience, design of precincts, and Indigenous lens together.
Thank you, Matilda, for that question. There is a way, of course, and there is a whole range of different types of frameworks out there. And looking at, when we think about cultural competency frameworks, we think of the AATSIS, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Code of Ethics and Guidelines for things like that. There's also, I just mentioned earlier, one of the ARCs, which is looking at the Australian Indigenous Design Charter and also the International Indigenous Design Charter's best practice documents to platform how all facets of design thinking, creative practice is Indigenous led from the front. So what that means, and I give an example, is for Geelong City Council were building a new council building, which is not specifically an Indigenous space, so to speak. It wasn't like a community or co-op or an Indigenous institute or somewhat. So the council, Geelong Council, implemented the Indigenous Design Charter to lead the project. So Wurrung people then, and also Indigenous communities around the Greater Geelong region and beyond could run workshops and yarnings to actually create the narrative to influence the tender documents to go out to architects. So from the beginning, so that's an example of what Indigenous-led means. So Indigenous-led means that you need to consult and engage and have practice deep listening with Indigenous peoples to actually improve and things, not as I said, as an add-on. So these things are possible. Also, always influence that the institution employs more Indigenous people. I mean, look at institutions, you look at the percentage of Indigenous peoples working in institutions, it's pitiful. Every university in Australia is disgusting. I'd say Monash is. There's 9 full-time Indigenous academics at RMIT. Let's call it out. Let's just do it. Just simple. I mean, they're multi-billion-dollar institutions. It's more like when we think about in my career, I've had the opportunity to teach with younger Indigenous people. There's those opportunities as well. Bring someone along as a junior researcher, build their capacity, build their career, invest in people as well is always a good way. And what the three of us have been talking about is this matrix of relations, or matrix of relationality. And by doing so, you build your relationality with Indigenous peoples as well. So, that's my suggestion is it's not project driven, it's relational driven, which is really important.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thanks for the question, Metal. I think someone else, there's Melanie, is it? Sorry, my eyesight is terrible. It's not because I can't read.
Your line.
Yeah. My name is Welin. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at University Malaya in Malaysia. And I come from one of the indigenous groups from east of Malaysia in Borneo Island. I just would like to ask 2 questions, if I may. Okay. What do you think of representations of folklore and indigenous knowledge through digitizations or some other applications and platforms? Because as much as we know, indigenous knowledge has always been passed down orally and also become the wisdom of our elders. So when there are such platforms to disseminate indigenous knowledge, are these actions undermine the role of the elders? That's my questions. To Brian or to...
Well, I do. Part of that is those stories that you talked about before that I've worked on with young ones. It's about how I transition that knowledge to our urban youth or kids. I look at some of those stories, I remember stories as my child, and it gave me an understanding how I fit within the society that I come from. So I'm working with augmented realities, and it gives me taking something what was intangible and making it tangible for the way young people learn. So it's a tool. I use it as part of a tool, but it like you say, it's a shared and how you live that experience. And, it's honouring the stories that scaffold my process of my being. And it's a sharing. It's a tool that reminds us that what makes us that point of difference, that there is a difference. That's what you grow up in. And even if it was seen in one light as a deficit, but it was an asset in my world, because it grounded me. And it took a long time to understand that was my role and responsibility. So it's also about my authority and sharing that, because a lot of children don't have that experiential process of growing up with their elders or sharing those stories and building it in a way that gives children a purpose in what their purpose is within our society. So it's strengthening. You become the elder for all. You're the multi-skilled elder that shares and builds, hopefully, a strong nation with that generosity that was given to you over the generations. I'm in my 70s, so it's the sharing of that. I have a responsibility to continue passing it on.
I think also, it's also about not only, it's not really about like a dilution of knowledge. It's about the efficacy of knowledge, how that's done as well. And I mean, Indigenous digital futures is really important. But once again, it's like, ASIS are doing a lot of work about digitising the archive language as well. So and these are really important technologies, but once again, it's the ethical application of technology to knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, how it's done. So it's both positive and negative, but the university's been both positive and negative as well. So once again, it comes down to the ethical application of those things, which can be very exciting as well. So.
Yeah.
I think you had a second question.
I think it was too bound up in the.
Do you have another, or was that connected?
Yeah, it's really connected. Thank you so much for answering the questions, because I'm basically doing like augmented reality, and I also develop applications to convey not just to the young generations in the community, but also to the others, because they need to understand our element of culture, because if they don't understand, they will be suspicious. That's what I thought. So I've been doing a lot of exhibitions that deals with applications, and also the documentations through visual and audio, and specifically because I'm working with traditional textile. It has a lot of abstractions, and I remember Brian was speaking about abstractions, and sometimes a lot of these abstractions has been extracted negatively and be misunderstood. And most of the times when foreign researchers come to deal with these textiles, it is always at a very superficial level because they don't speak the language. And as anthropologists always say, if you don't speak the language, you don't really able to immerse yourself or embrace the culture, and you tend to misunderstood what really the content is. So I think I play a very big role here, because as an Indigenous person myself, I bring in all this. And thank you for your wisdom, and I'm so happy to be in this conversation.
Thank you, Welny. Sorry, I mispronounced your name, no doubt. I really appreciate your contribution. It is in the spirit of ethical relationships. It is 5 o'clock, and everyone has a life and things to do. And I'm just going to thank you, Narwit, Carolyn, and thank you, Brian. Really appreciate your time today. I'm sure everyone else out there would like to pass their thanks on too. Thank you, everyone, for logging in to the conversation. Nicole from Nonfiction Lab has just put up a bit of spruiking of the next event on the 18th of November. So if you've not engaged with Nonfiction Lab before, I guess you can also check out their website. But on behalf of us as colleagues at Wominjeka Djeembana, and on behalf of myself as just uninvited guest, as I should say, in Australia also, really appreciate this time together with Auntie and Brian. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.